Good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is John Hamry, and we wanted to start on time, even though one of our panelists is not here. We've got word that he got hung up. He'll be here shortly, but we've got a huge audience out in cyberspace, and I didn't think we should keep anybody waiting. So we're going to get going, and I want to say thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. You know, this grew out of a conversation that I had with Henrietta Fore about needing to lift up public understanding about the important role that USTR plays, USAID plays in America's overall foreign policy. I mean, here, Rob is. Yeah, he's coming in right now. You know, when I came to CSIS, I was a defense guy. I'd been a defense guy for 25 years, and I'm into hard power, you know, I mean, and it was one of the most startling learning experiences of my life to realize how powerful soft power is compared to hard power. Hard power is, boy, you've run out of options and you only have one tool and it doesn't work very well, you know, and it tends to create an environment that you have to live with for a long time and you can't manage, you know. When Joe and I invented the term soft power, at the time, I love Joe, and he's on our board and a dear friend, and I thought, well, that's a terrible name, you know, soft power. The only thing you sell in America that's soft is Kleenex and toilet paper and puff things and whatever, you know, you don't sell anything with hard, you know. But he was right. It captured a worldview that was extremely important, and because America's inspirational powers are so much more important and powerful than are our powers of intimidation. And we're going to explore that today. I think these inspirational powers, now, I should say, America is inspiring not when it gives lectures to the world about how inspiring we are, okay? I mean, we're probably been pretty content for the last 15, 20 years just to, come on, President, come on up. No, please. I know you're hung up in traffic. Thank you so much for coming. You know, we've been giving lectures to the world that we're so fabulous, but we haven't been doing anything. And we were just having a conversation while we were getting ready. You know, the world is waiting for America to have a trade policy, waiting to have a development policy. You know, the world is open for America, but we don't have it in hand. And that's what we're going to explore today. So I want to say thank you to all four of you. It's really wonderful. Peter McPherson is sitting out here. We ought to get another chair up here because he's also been an administrator at USAID. But it's going to be a great thing. I hope we make this a permanent feature because USAID is doing such important work in the most important dimension for America these days, and we don't understand it well enough, but we're going to learn now. Dan, let me turn to you.
Thanks so much. You know, we are in an age of great power competition, and it's not your grandparents' developing world either, and the developing world is richer, it's freer, it's healthier, with a lot more agency and a lot more options. And in this environment, USAID is going to play a really important role. I think the United States is the greatest force of good in human history, and I think AID has been one of the greatest forces of good in human history. And I'm really happy to have former aid administrators with us today to talk about this. We have the former aid administrator from the Obama administration, Dr. Rajiv Shah. Thanks, Raj, for being here. We have the former USAID administrator from the George W. Bush administration, Administrator Henrietta Fore. Thanks, Henrietta, for doing this. The former USAID administrator from the Obama administration, my friend Gayle Smith. Thanks, Gayle, for doing this. And then the former USAID administrator in the Trump administration, Ambassador Mark Green. Thanks, Ambassador Green, for doing this. Thanks, Mark, for doing this. So, look, I think, you know, we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So my ask was to have each of our speakers make sort of an opening statement on, and I left it relatively open, which was that given this new age of great power competition, we are seeing challenges and opportunities that require a soft power or development response. So given this new world that we're in, what role should USAID be playing? And so my hope was that each of our colleagues could could take a stab and kind of take that in any direction they wanted to. So I'm going to start first with Administrator Fore, since this was your great idea to do this, and thanks for encouraging us to do this. I'm going to start with you.
All right, so let me pick up on what John Hamre was saying about America and how we see America, because I think one of the most important roles that USAID has is to be America in the world. And so for me, I think USAID's role has to be that of being a builder of opportunities, a builder of benefits, so that you can see a prosperous, peaceful society at home and abroad. And I think USAID is very important for that. It has been a force for good over the decades, and it has built institutions, it has built knowledge, and it has given power to people in a way that's been very important for the world's progress and for world peace. So how do you do that? I do believe that development and humanitarian work is essential within USAID. That has sometimes been a debate as to whether or not we should be one or the other, short-term or long-term. I think in the end, development is a very complex and international and long-term activity. So we have to think of it in the long term. And I think there are 3 areas that I would tag for the future that I wish we would spend more time on. And one is a favorite that you will know from me, which is that I think we do not use our economic power well enough. There's often a division, sort of like church and state, between private companies and the federal government. And as America, we have such strength in that area that we should use it for the good. And it's a key moment to do that. So I would put that number 1 on my agenda. I see so many programs that USAID has done around the world that don't have sustainability because they don't have public and private finance behind them. And so then the project goes away, the program goes away, people are disappointed, and America leaves. We don't have to do that. We could use public and private finance. The second area that I think we don't utilize enough is our vast knowledge in technology for good. And many of us in the past few years have seen how that has operated and what key benefits you can get from technology. I was just this morning in some programs on health, and just diagnostics now with the technologies that are available. What an enormous boom for health around the world. Well, America should use their technology to help foreign assistance. And the third area that I would tag is, to John's point, something that is in soft power. And it's our values. Democracy is sometimes seen as such a fractured, diverse, messy activity that it's hard sometimes to connect it to values. But America has values, real intrinsic values about justice and honesty and rule of law and the benefits to a person, and that people should be able to be peaceful and prosperous. We should use our values. We should lead with our values, and I would love to see more of that. So those are my opening thoughts on what we could be doing as USAID.
Amen. That's great. Let me ask Administrator Gayle Smith if you have some opening comments you'd like to make.
My first comment is that Henrietta Fore just scored points with Rajiv Shah for her mention of technology. So,
Vice versa.
Look, USAID is really, really important right now. And I think, I agree with what John said. I think we need some construct that isn't hard power and soft power, because I think there's some perception that, like, soft power is just girls being nice or something.
Totally.
Right? Yep. It's an elective. It's not a required course. So one of the things I think we need to do is rethink that. Soft implies
Somebody
it's
ought to
got
write
less.
a book about that.
Somebody ought to, or Joe ought to modernize the language. Soft implies less impact, less visibility. Yeah. And I think it's quite the contrary. Yeah. So that's number one. Like Henrietta, I would say there are 3 things that I think are really key. One is continuing to be the first and the fastest to arrive when people are in distress. And that's the humanitarian side of USAID. I've seen it my whole life. I certainly saw it when I was administrator, that people knew, regardless of what party was in power, that if people were in distress, if it was a war, if it was an earthquake, if it was Ebola, the United States was going to be the first and fastest to stand with them. And that's not only a projection of our values and solidarity with other human beings, but it is something that over time and decades, the amount of goodwill and confidence in the United States that is accrued from that is extraordinary. You can't touch it or measure it like you can the number of vaccines that have been administered, but it's tangible, it's real. The second is an innovative collaborator. And I think AID's tried over the years, and some efforts more successful than others, to figure out how to partner, whether it's with the private sector, whether it's with tech companies, whether it is with other donors. I think one of the things I would like to see is USAID use its position to collaborate to achieve scale. Right? AID's got all sorts of windows, opportunities, chances. Raj, some that you set up for on the tech side or on the investment side. How do we use those so that when there is a great innovation that comes out of a grand challenge, USAID is in the lead in pulling in the UN agencies, the private sector, the financiers, the governments, the others who need to be at the table to take that innovation to scale? Because we've got a vast array of innovative things, right? Systems, gadgets, techniques that we can use and deploy. But somebody's got to take it to scale. And I think USAID actually could use its convening power to do that. I think the third gets a little bit to Henrietta's point on values, but it goes a little bit beyond that, which is I think aid needs to be the leading voice around the table in the US government that helps the government understand the extraordinary process of change that we're seeing right now. Development has changed dramatically. The thoughts on it, the voice on it, who's got agency in terms of development, how the development community thinks about ODA and private capital, debates about the future of the World Bank and the other MDBs, debates about refashioning the global financial architecture. These are things that are real. And right now, the US isn't seen as prominent in those debates and discussions as it might be. I think it's an issue that we need to understand very, very well, whether it's the influence of China. Whatever it may be, there's a future coming in terms of how younger generations are thinking about how economies should work, who should own development and who should run it. And aid is such a powerful voice at the table. I'm thrilled that President Biden has made official USAID being part of the Principals Committee, which is something that we started. It was actually a welcome gift to Raj. I was at the White House at the time, and he became aid administrator, and Haiti had an earthquake and split in two. And we weren't going to have a Principals Committee meeting on Haiti and the earthquake without the aid administrator. And so it became a de facto thing, and I think continued, Mark, also for you. And I'm sure because it was Obama's policy, and so you guys, just kidding.
Just carried it over.
Donald Trump was like, hey, Barack did that.
Copy,
anyway,
paste.
But the power of that voice at the table, not to discount the power of the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, each had its own perspective, but aid is the voice at the table that understand how states transition, how communities develop, how economies shift and change over a long horizon of time. And I think that voice needs to be louder and more active on the international stage and translating that into the debates that go on around that table.
Thanks. Ambassador Green.
Well, first off, congratulations on your book. I'll mention it specifically, The American Imperative. I'm delighted that you have had such a great discussion about soft power in American foreign policy. It's also my chance to thank my predecessors. When I was at AID, I stood on their shoulders in terms of the tools and programs we had, but also they were always there for me whenever I had a question or concern, and that's a story that doesn't get told often enough, but it really is a club in which we compare notes all the time. So a few thoughts. I really think that we're at a crossroads moment with foreign assistance, development policy. First off, there are some remarkable developments and successes. There have been a lot of references to technology. In this town, we tend to think technology only in big terms. We should be looking at the frugal technology innovations on the ground in so many parts of the world. It's extraordinary, it's dynamic, and quite frankly, we're well behind the curve when it comes to that. Second major development that's positive, business has business in the developing world. The private commercial flows create opportunities for USAID that we didn't have 20 years ago and 30 years ago. If we're smart enough to harness the power of private enterprise, there's no limit to what we can do. New challenges as well. USAID is no longer the sole player. Externally, we talk a lot about rivals like China, but also here in the US. I mean, one regret that I have is that I think foreign assistance has become overly fragmented. I'm guessing every administration comes into office convinced that they're going to unify, but we always end up making it worse, whether we intended to or not. And I do think we have to do a better job at pulling it together, how we align these tools and how we use these tools. And then also, I've really been struck by something that the director of the IMF has been saying. We're in a shock-prone world. And so many of the forces at play are not forces that we really anticipated 10 and 20 years ago. We're seeing obviously fallout from extreme climate, from climate change that's creating conflicts and stresses in so many parts of the world. I think that's one. Number two, and Henrietta and I have been doing some work together on this, human displacement. 105 million displaced people in the world. People are not where they were, not where they're going to be, and increasingly we're seeing young mothers in motion, and we're not doing a very good job at building our programs around this phenomenon in ways that can reach out to people that we need to reach out to. Also, something that I think is important for us all to be looking at, so many of the key tools that we have, including global health policy, were crafted in a radically different time.
100%.
I mean, and we're living in a different environment, and one thing that we've not done very well that really we need to sort of pause and look at, what does success look like? Because some of these tools, some of these programs, we measured progress very differently than we are right now. And I look at so many of our programs are not applicable to countries that we have all said are strategically important. Half of Africa is middle income right now, and so a lot of the tools that we have don't apply. Well, we need to recalibrate or rethink or define success differently. I think this is AID's moment, but it won't just happen. It's really going to be, I think, thoughtful minds coming together and sitting down and redefining success. How do we measure progress? Are these tools appropriately calibrated? What is the bargain that we offer to partners around the world? One thing we were talking about, and I'm an Africa guy for most of my career, and a lot of our tools in Africa were designed to help countries rise to the point where they can be trading partners. And as everyone has said up here, we don't really have a trade policy right now. So what do we say to our friends in Africa? What, never mind?
You're just kidding?
We need to rethink. These are not aimed at any one administration or party. This is a broader moment, I think, where all of us need to come together and say, okay, Now, this is an important tool in American foreign policy. What do we want it to look like? How should we measure success? And if we were to start from scratch today, which I'm not suggesting we do, but if we were to start from scratch today, would we really design the programs the way that they were designed? I think they're good questions to take up.
What I tell policymakers and presidential candidates is if we don't meet the hopes and aspirations of people in developing countries, they're going to take their business to China. So we can pick. And so we can't fight something with nothing. And I think that you've put your finger on something. Agree. Administrator Shah, thanks for being here.
Raj.
Raj. I've been telling everybody administrator. I've been saying everybody administrator, but we can go first names.
We bump into each other in airports.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
I haven't since BC, since before COVID, right? Exactly.
Well, it's great to be here. Congrats on the book.
Thank you.
And I violently agree with everything that's been said so far. Just to kind of illustrate Mark's point about how much we all depend on each other. It was Henrietta that created the Development Leadership Initiative that effectively provided the kind of high quality staffing that allowed us to build Feed the Future and so many Electrify Africa programs that then Gayle got passed as legislation during her tenure, and Mark has carried forward. And I just feel like we all benefit so much from learning from each other and extending those pieces of work. And what I'd love for people watching this to appreciate is just how incredibly bipartisan the support for USAID is, given the zeitgeist of being more focused on public-private collaboration, understanding that this part of our foreign policy and our national security policy is about extending American values to the farthest corner of the globe and observing the reaction to that when done with an authentic purpose. And rebuilding an institution capable of doing that consistently across very difficult problems and challenges. So given that, we should have, frankly, much more support and visibility for development in the context of our national security decision-making. And probably no one has done more over many, many years than Gayle to put in place the structures that have allowed development to be ever more significant as part of our national security policy. So that's the first point I'd make, is this just has to be a bigger part of how America shows up at home and around the world. Second point I'd make is, we should ask ourselves, is the Western development construct established after World War II meeting the moment today? As Mark points out, the moment is a tough one. The IMF has predicted a decade of real divergence in human development outcomes. If you just look at hunger as a kind of broad indicator of extreme poverty, we had about 14% of total population in that position, hungry or extremely poor, in the mid-1990s. That went down to 7% by 2015 and is back up north of 10% now. And the reason for that is the response to COVID, as well-intentioned as it was in a macroeconomic sense hugely inequitable. The wealthy countries spent trillions of dollars, 30+% of GDP in monetary and fiscal stimulus to create a floor. So you could see in the US with the child tax credit, child poverty went down by 50%. Meanwhile, most developing countries where USAID works did maybe 2% of GDP, creating a floor. And the result, when you compound the Russian war in Ukraine and the consequences of climate change and food prices, is you have this resurgence of poverty that is undermining decades of progress against the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'd argue that right now, the whole system is not set up effectively to meet the moment, and we're sort of losing. And as a result, you had 17 votes from Africa against the United States on the Russia-Ukraine resolution. You have obviously greater ascendance of China as a financier of infrastructure and the intended access to natural resources that comes with that. It's not a pretty future if we don't do things differently. So, the good news is there are some voices out there led by Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, and this administration, Janet Yellen, has done a great job of framing a set of policy responses that could help reinvigorate global development financing and reestablish for the Western world a global development framework that is up to the moment we're in. But I fear we're not quite there, and we have a long way to go together to get there.
Thanks. All right, so we're gonna use first names. Is that okay? Is that, no one's gonna be offended? All right, good. All right, good. So I think I've got several questions I need to ask you all. So I was in Kiev 10 days ago with President Zelensky. I've got appointed to the board of the Enterprise Fund for Ukraine and Moldova. You'll remember that, Henrietta. And so I went representing that because we put money into a new private equity fund. So I was with them, 10 days ago. So I think this is the great cause of our time. I think there's an enormous role for economic assistance. The United States of America is showing up in an enormous way. I guess the question I'd have is I'd ask you each to make the case for ongoing humanitarian and economic assistance for Ukraine. How do we make the case for those, especially who might go wobbly on providing assistance? And I'm thinking about folks in the Republican Party. I'm going to out myself. I think everyone knows I'm a Republican. So I'm concerned about that. And so I think I know for a fact there are serious Republicans who are they get no love for this in their district. They don't get any hugs for this. They don't get any votes for this, and they get a lot of crap. So, and specifically, what is the argument for those people who need to vote the right way and need to do the right thing? So I'd ask you each to make the case for why we need to continue to sustain assistance in Ukraine. And in particular, one of the issues I think that's hot right now is how do we ensure that there's not, this quote unquote money doesn't get stolen? So I think that's the other issue that's come up as well. So let me start with you, Mark.
Well, first off, it's easy to make the argument about moving against Russia, right? With all that Russia has done to destroy the rule of law and to undermine the sovereignty of its neighbors. That's easy. The case that I would make is the opportunity that Ukraine presents. This is a country with a motivated populace who have turned to Europe, want to be part of Europe, and can be a great and vibrant member of the community of democracies and Europe. And so they deserve our partnership and support for that reason as much as anything else. So that to me is the most important reason for it. As a former member of Congress, nobody ever gets support for foreign assistance of any kind, anywhere in the district. But on the other hand, there are some common sense notions here that I think members should be expressing to their constituents. First off, 95% of the world's population lives outside the United States. If we're going to have a growing economy, if we're going to have an economy in which good paying jobs are created, we need to be able to partner with those countries that are seeking to partner with us. Ukraine represents a very important potential trading partner. I think we need to work harder in helping them as they emerge in crafting their capacities to be trade partners. And then also, when I look at the fallout in Africa from the war, and this has done tremendous damage to the agricultural economies in so many African countries, we need a vibrant, growing Ukraine that is able to export and be good trading partners to Africa, but also some of the inputs that will help African food security emerge. So that, to me, the benefits for investing in Ukraine are not just about Ukraine, they're also about expanding opportunities in areas like food security in so much of the world.
Gayle?
I'm not going to repeat what my friend Mark has just said, and I think he's right. And I think there are a lot of arguments that we all make and are kind of obvious. There's the economic argument. There's the political argument at a time of democracy sliding back in a lot of places and authoritarianism on the rise. Geopolitical. There are plenty of arguments to be made. I think if you want to convince people who might go wobbly, which is one of my favorite expressions, There are two things you got to have in hand to make the case. Number one is, what's the burden sharing agreement? Is what is the United States going to put in, but what is Europe going to put in? And to be a little bit careful about that when thinking about the pots of money that are for the whole world, because I'll confess that one of my concerns, building on Mark's comment about Africa, is that at the spring meetings of the bank and the fund this year, they talked about $50 billion over 10 years, an additional $5 billion a year, with what it's already estimated.
For Ukraine.
No, for the world.
For the world.
And with what is estimated it will cost to rebuild Ukraine, Ukraine would eat all of that. And that's not, there needs to be a different, smarter burden sharing than that, because that's going to reinforce, I think, a lot of the resentment, misunderstanding that contributes to Raj saying rightly that we're kind of losing right now. So bilaterally, from the United States, Europe, Canada, whoever else, what's the burden sharing arrangement? Anybody who's about to go wobbly is going to ask that, and they're going to have a good argument if it's the U.S. is going to pay 90%, and somebody else is going to pay 10%. So that's number one. I think the second is this going to be an aid, not I mean USAID, I mean a foreign assistance-led reconstruction or a private sector-led reconstruction? And I think Ukraine's economy is at a level of development that, yes, there will be need for foreign assistance and grant funding. But I think there's also a way to conceptualize the rebuilding of Ukraine that is much more private sector than we usually do in those
100%.
cases. Because usually we do kind of 90% foreign aid, and then we have a couple little projects for the private sector on the side. And if you go back to World War II, Raj, you made the reference, rebuilding Europe was about building a market and an economy. And if we go in that way, I think it's a good argument, but I think we bring more tools to the table. So I would have answers to those two questions before I met any potentially wobbly person in a dark alley.
I 100% agree with that. We're running a Ukraine Reconstruction Commission here, and after 200 meetings on this in the last year, my deepest thought is we need to align.
We shouldn't have so many meetings.
We should have so many meetings, right? But what I would say is my deepest thought is we need to align reconstruction with EU accession, and sort of the reforms required as part of that will make Ukraine attractive as a place to do business as part of the European Union. So 100% agree. Henrietta?
So let me pick up on something that Mark said about World War II. So after World War II, we were, to Gayle's point, building a market, but we were also building a region. It wasn't just one country. So I think one of the lessons we need to take away is that for anyone thinking of going wobbly, is you need to help that whole band of countries that we used to call Eastern Europe is now Central Europe, but you have to help the group. Partnership matters. And in this case, a critical mass also matters. You need trading partners. You need it to hang together, or there won't be a lasting peace. So that's one. The second is the world is watching. To Raj's point, and we are losing in the theater of public opinion in a way that we shouldn't be. And so if large countries like in India, in Indonesia, Turkey are on the fence, you notice the votes in the United Nations from the African nations. This is, and they're worried that we prioritize Ukraine, just as we did COVID vaccines, into the developed world, and that we're going to forget about the developing world. So this is a time where it could be USAID's moment to lead and to understand what it means to actually have a world watching, and how the United States can be a real beacon for how to do it well. And then the third point is, I'll go back to values. I think our values are such that when we see a little country that's being invaded by a big country,
We have a sense of fairness.
yes, and that it's their land. And as a result, I think values. So I would do those three to anyone.
Thanks.
Going well.
Raj, you are an investor in Horizon Capital with Rockefeller Foundation. Thanks for doing that. As you know, it was spun out of the Western Newly Independent States Enterprise Fund. So we were thinking nice thoughts about the Rockefeller Foundation in Kiev. So I'd love your thoughts about this as well. I know you're following this closely.
Well, I agree with everything that's been said, so I'll just add one other thought, which is in 2014, I had a chance when I was administrator to visit Maidan Square right after the massacre there, and there were still bullets in the brick walls and blood stains that had yet to be cleaned away. And a lot of the people giving the tour were part of a series of civil society organizations that had done everything from kind of organize the next steps from that perspective, but previously had been a part of real anti-corruption efforts and exposing a lot of the corruption that was taking place. And I was both surprised and so incredibly proud to know that they were USAID grantees. Almost uniformly, they were sort of those college students and others, as civil society activists always are, right? And whatever happens with the reconstruction, I agree with Henrietta's point. USAID has an extraordinary opportunity to bring every element of its values, public-private investment, public grants for infrastructure, organization of the global deal that Gayle made reference to, and our core values around civil society, transparency, anti-corruption, and democracy to the future.
So I spent a year sitting in my basement because of COVID, and I think everyone else did too. I was not happy about doing that, and I think not anyone here was happy about doing that. So, but we're going to have other funny named diseases. We're going to have other funny named pandemics show up in the future. So let me start with you, Raj. What should AID be doing to confront future pandemics?
Well, first of all, I think AID is doing a great job already, and want to give a real shout out to the health team at AID for being so proactive, led by Atul Gawande, who's now the health leader there. And I think when you look to the future, we all have fought pandemics in different contexts at home and abroad. I mean, the number one thing the world has to do is build a much differentiated capacity for rapid diagnostic capability in developing countries around the world. That is a huge global public good. It's not just going to be traditional labs and lab equipment and surveillance. It's going to have to include wastewater surveillance systems and data analytics and prediction, all the modern tools of weather, everything from weather forecasting to what is actually happening inside a lab test. And that's a large investment, but one that's grain size lends itself to the kind of thing USAID, a group of bilateral partners, and others working with the Global Fund and others should be able to try to build up quickly.
So do we need like a FuseNet, a famine early warning system, kind of something that rhymes with that for this? Well,
yeah, yes, absolutely we do. WHO is trying to create it in this thing they call the Berlin Hub, which is great, but there needs to be a much more integrated, much more global approach. And frankly, FuseNet is fantastic, but FuseNet was built a long time ago. If you were rebuilding FuseNet, you would use much more predictive analytic tools and data. Okay. And that's the kind of area that USAID shines. It's bringing together, Peter's here, Peter does so much with the universities, bringing together technical and capabilities and innovation to build for the world the eyes, ears, and diagnostic capacity to stop pandemics before they really start. That's what the job should be.
So just in terms of vaccines as well, I have this vision of TGI Fridays where you give you those buzzers and say, like, wait for your table. And what happened during the pandemic was the good stuff wasn't available for the developing world. We basically gave them a buzzer and said, we'll get to you in 6 months, we'll get to you in 12 months. And so during that period, Sinovac and Sputnik, there were a number of I can think of the Western Hemisphere where a number of countries where the Chinese Communist Party went to a number of our allies and said, we've heard rumors you're thinking about switching your recognition to Taiwan. You wouldn't want to do that because we've got a plane load of vaccines that we're going to fill in because the West has told you take a number and we'll get you in about 12 months. And they said, no, we're not going to switch our recognition from Taiwan to the main, we're not going to do that. Or we've also heard a rumor that you're thinking about not including our very fine firm Huawei in your tech network. You're not going to do that either. So I can think of at least 3 countries where that happened in the Western Hemisphere. How do we deal with this issue of sort of, in essence, where the Chinese Communist Party or Russia can fill a vacuum in the vaccine space? I mean, we've been trying for decades to try and have sort of additional vaccine production capacity. Isn't that also something because I just think we can't pull the TGI Fridays move anymore
I
and
think,
say, hey, take a number in,
Yeah.
in this world that we're in.
I would probably articulated that experience slightly differently, but Gayle led the effort from the State Department and is probably the right person on this panel to answer the question.
So I'll come back to you, Kim.
So what I would say is, yes, China did that, but they also failed because their vaccine wasn't very good, and the Russian vaccine, I still don't know if anybody's ever taken it.
If you have a choice, I agree with
But
that.
hold on, but Dan, I was working this with all
Yeah.
these countries
Yeah.
at the time. So what we constantly heard, and yes, the US was late in the provision of vaccines, but in fact, the whole world, I mean, think about it. We had a global pandemic, and it wasn't until Joe Biden had been in office for 3 months that world leaders met on it. It had been going on for over a year. Like, if a global pandemic doesn't cause world leaders to get in the same room, we're going to have to think hard about what it takes. So I wouldn't put it exclusively on the US. I think the international community failed utterly in the first year of the pandemic to come up with an epidemiologically and politically smart plan to vaccinate the world. The pandemic would have ended sooner. There was a systematic way to do it. All it took was leadership and cooperation. We had neither for quite some time. So we were late, but I think in fairness to President Biden, he came in well after the pandemic had started. Now, I think we were still late. There was pressure on every country that had vaccines to get their people vaccinated. It's not the first time we've seen this. H1N1, we saw the exact same thing where rich countries bought all the vaccines and there was very little. Samantha Power and I in the back rooms of the old executive office building tried to finagle a way to get them to donate to poor countries then. So it's a structural problem. I think that what we found was a couple things. One, the overwhelming preference was for Pfizer, Moderna, and to a certain point J&J, because it was a single shot, and then there were some problems with it. And so yes, countries were offered the Chinese vaccine, and a few were offered Sputnik. They didn't want it. Some of them even waited or revaccinated. The lesson to take away from this, and I think it's part of the role of USAID, is that part of what we should be doing is building the capacity of countries to prevent, detect, and respond. And we all said this after Ebola, and we got a great thing started, and the G7 really supported it until they stopped supporting it because after about a year, the images and the fear of Ebola faded and everybody moved on to something else. We're already seeing with the COVID pandemic that the world is moving on to something else. Everyone says we're going to have another pandemic. But we're not seeing the allocation of resources or the political will or the kind of collaboration we need to prevent the next one. I think USAID's got such a tremendous track record on health. And if I can answer your general question, I would add one other thing to this, which is if USAID can help be part of making what the United States does in global health truly collaborative, because sometimes there's a little competition. I mean, is that a secret?
Within the interagency, you mean?
You think?
Yeah.
And because we've got USAID.
Do you want to name names?
We've got PEPFAR, and we've got CDC. Fantastic tools. Streamline those, figure out the division of labor, figure out where those three things add up, and focus on building the capacity. And the ways to do it, you talked about global health programs, Mark, and would we design them the same now that we did 20 years ago? Of course we wouldn't. Now is the time to reimagine that and update and modernize those programs to be doing something they're already doing, but they could do more of, which is building capacity. And I think it's a huge opportunity. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for USAID to lead on this, but I think it's an urgent necessity because near as I can tell, the world has moved on.
Yeah.
And we are going to be no better prepared for the next pandemic than we were for this one.
Oh, I agree with that. So I just go back to, there was a we flooded the zone. I think we've answered the mail, but it took about 12 months. But if I had a choice between a crap vaccine or no vaccine, I went with a crap vaccine. So if I was Uruguay or the Dominican Republic or El Salvador, I took the crap vaccine because Moderna and Pfizer and J&J
Look,
weren't
I
available
agree.
for 12 months.
They should have been available, and the world should have come together.
Yes.
I mean, it was extraordinary what was done to develop a vaccine so quickly.
Yes.
The failure was of the world's vaccine producers also, not just governments. Let's remember, the vaccine producers, don't get me started on this, could have gotten in the same room and said, how do we cover the planet? That didn't happen. And the world's political leaders didn't come together, any of them. So I think you're right. And it was a huge, huge foul that we will pay for a long time.
Just one more thing. In authoritarian regimes, you can hold back vaccines of your people. So I believe that the Chinese Communist Party and Russia held back vaccinating their people so that they could, in that 12-month period, kind of steal a march on the West and offer vaccines
But I don't think
outside.
that's what hurt us. I don't think that's what hurt us, Stan. I think what hurt us was what we've heard so many times from colleagues in Africa, which, in reference more to the G7 than just the US, we thought we could depend on you, and it turns out we couldn't. None of them said we were so grateful that China or Russia stepped in. So, I mean, I have to say, on other things, on infrastructure, for sure. But on this one, I think it was more the absence of us than the presence of anybody else that was the...
Mark.
Couple of issues. So first off, an argument to why this needs to reside with USAID. We can't do pandemic preparedness. We can't silo it. We can't organize ourselves around the next COVID-like pandemic.
Because we're going to have another
epidemic.
one. We're going to have another one.
And who's to say it'll be anything like COVID? There are things that we know. So we know that we're going to need more doctors, more healthcare workers, more nurses, more health centers. Let's invest in that now. These are things that we can do now. And we should be measuring the health capacity of every country that partners with the U.S. Do it now. Don't wait for the last moment. Secondly, the other reason why it needs to reside with USAID, don't forget a key element here. And one of the lessons out of the Ebola response, the Ebola response in Eastern DRC in my days, deaths went up after there was a vaccine and after there was an intervention. Why? Because nobody believed the government when they said we've got a vaccine intervention. Why? Because you had leadership for which the people had no trust whatsoever. So you have to invest in governance. You have to invest in messaging. You have to invest in reaching out to communities. So if we do pandemic preparedness separately off here, we're going to fail. Absolutely going to fail. And part of it, Dan, when we look at Africa, and actually in Latin America, even in more than in Africa, part of it was our messaging was all screwed up. And so by the time that vaccines were available, we had allowed the other side, quite frankly, in my view, the bad guys, to so undermine the vaccines that people weren't even coming forward. So, again, sadly, we learn the hard way from every infectious disease outbreak. We learn, and USAID, quite frankly, is very good at lessons learned. We learn from every outbreak. It's crucial that we learn from COVID-19, not simply in the very important public health vaccine capacity in places like Africa, but also stepping back and looking at governance and looking at the healthcare infrastructure. So these are things that we can do now, and it is crucial, building on what so many have said here, we cannot allow funding for these crucial capacities to go soft in Congress. This is not the time to say, okay, well, COVID's behind us, let's shift the funding here. It would be a terrible tragedy. So this is the time to learn the lessons, to invest in those capacities, including in responsive governance now. Can't do it after the next outbreak. We've seen what happens when we're behind the 8 ball. This is really the moment.
Henrietta, you were at UNICEF, and UNICEF's one of the largest providers of vaccines in the world, so I suspect you have some thoughts about this.
I do, thank you.
Yeah.
So what Mark and Raj had started on, which was we really need to relook at the tools that we have. we learned a lot during the pandemic. It was an extraordinary time for learning and what it means if the world is going to try to respond to something. So there have been a few groups that have been set up. The World Bank and WHO have one that's doing pandemic preparedness in the future. So prevention, preparedness, and resilience, and assessing countries, because this isn't just a US issue. This is a world issue. USAID has this extraordinary health staff and always has. I mean, it really has stayed solid. So if you can focus on what it is that America will bring to it, the question that came earlier, I would tag on to what Raj said about the laboratories that are being set up now in Africa and other places. We really need laboratories in every continent in the world. It's good for business, it's good for public health. That will be helpful. Training, the training point that Mark had made, I mean, you can learn on your cell phone some basic health issues, and we need hundreds of thousands of community workers. And it doesn't matter what the issue will be, but we're going to need that. We got in UNICEF we got vaccines out to more than 170 countries, and many of those were in the first days. Many countries weren't ready because they didn't know what it meant to bring the vaccines in. They didn't have an FDA, so they weren't approved within the country. They didn't have landing permits. They didn't have a way to get it from one place to another. So that preparedness piece, it seems small, it's enormous. And American private entities can help a lot with that and can set that up now. So to Mark's point, now is the time, if America wants to lead, now is the time to get it together. And without America, when Gayle and the administration came in, it changed everything. So it made a difference. U.S. made a difference.
My point is that it's not 2015 anymore, and that the Chinese Communist Party can fill voids, including in public health, in ways maybe even 10 or 15 years ago that they couldn't. And so I think that's going to impact or disrupt kind of the public health landscape, the global health landscape as well. The great power competitions come to all sorts of theaters, including the global health landscape. You don't buy that?
No,
Tell me why.
because I think global health is one of the areas where China competes really, really, really poorly. Yeah, they had a vaccine. They didn't donate that vaccine. They said to countries, you can buy our vaccine. We gave the vaccines away, right?
I know that.
So, but I also think if you look at, like, if you had been talking infrastructure, I would have agreed entirely with what you said. That's where I think we are leaving a huge vacuum. Increasingly, if you look at how low-income countries are going to deal with debt servicing, we're leaving a vacuum there.
Problem there too.
Global public health is an area where the United States exceeds the performance, engagement, and experience of any country on earth, and everybody knows it. I think that the vaccines was less a function of global public health, not function, it was politics, let's be plain. That pandemic was politicized from day one, and that hurt all of us. But if you look at USAID's experience over time, Henrietta is absolutely right about the Global Health Bureau historically. Incredible experience in global health. Raj, what you did on global health when you were there to build that out, you've built it out as well. PEPFAR, it's extraordinary. So while I would agree with you 100% if you were going to talk about finance and infrastructure, global public health is one area where I think we are unmatched, and the wisest thing we could do would be to build on that, including on the preparedness side and the building capacity side, because I think it's absolutely signature for the United States and for USAID.
Yeah.
So one other point, I agree with everything that Gayle said. I think we run a risk when we look at everything through the lens and label of great power competition. One of the risks is that we define ourselves in those terms, and we look to sort of be almost China light or to respond to China. It's about us, right? Competition is about us, enhancing our capacities, our abilities, and taking those things that we're good at and mobilizing them and pushing them out. So Sure, we're all talking about China. Everyone's talking about China. But, in my experience anyway, in Africa, I don't recall one moment, whether I was a teacher or ambassador or administrator, I never had an African come up to me and say, you know what, I really want to be Chinese. We heard over and over again that they want a piece of the American dream. They don't call it the American dream, universal dream. So to me, I think there's a risk if we're constantly measuring ourselves in the tit for tat of great power competition, we overlook what we're good at. What we're really good at is Gayle laid out. I mean, I'll take what we do on public health and global health against anybody in the world. We don't talk about it enough. We're not full-throated enough. We do a lousy job in our messaging, and lousy job in our message here, but also, quite frankly, out in the markets. But we're good at what we do more of it, harness innovation, harness youthful capacity and aspiration.
Let me pivot. We're in a democracy recession. We could, I think for at least 15 years we've been in.
I'm going to push back on that too.
Okay, good. So I think that we ought to be pushing and supporting to have greater democracy in the world, reduce corruption, improve governance. Any improvements, I would say, since World War II on human rights, any improvement on fighting corruption, any improvements on sort of increasing freedom in the world, I would argue that it has required the United States of America to lead a coalition on those issues. We're imperfect. We've got lots of flaws. I think we could all make a list of all the flaws and challenges we have in this country. But ultimately, it's required a flawed vessel, the United States, to push and lead on these things. So USAID has been an important part of sort of working on these issues. So are we in a democracy recession? Are we not in a democracy recession? Regardless, I think there's a concern that, some of the Freedom House metrics, for example, have said that and Mark, when you were at AID, you encouraged kind of a revitalization or revisiting AID, re-engaging in some of these more difficult places in particular. I know that was an area that you put some focus on. So what's your response to that?
The reason I push back is we're not in a democracy deficit. We are in a democratic governance deficit. And it's a very different thing. Having just been an election observer in Nigeria and watching throngs of young people coming out to vote, and all of us have had that great experience. Well, look at the Maidan, Euro Maidan. So democracy is still the hope and dream and aspiration all around the world. We do have issues of responsive governance, corruption, democratic governance, but those are two different things, and I worry sometimes that we cede the ground. It isn't that suddenly people are turning and saying, yeah, we want authoritarianism. It's their leaders that are letting them down. It's not the throngs of particularly of young people. But one thing that I think, one of the last meetings I had when I was at USAID, I was over in Eastern Europe, and I was at a public session with a head of state, go nameless, but he said in a public setting, love USAID, love those programs, those tourism capacity building programs, they're all great. He said, here's what I need. He said, I need help in training young people on how to govern openly, transparently, and without corruption. He said, remember, those countries that come from particularly a communist past, we assume that transparency is the natural state of things, and it's not for many countries. So, we spend a lot of time preaching, and we're pretty good with the stick. We do a lousy job of helping to train in transparent governance at the community level and up. And so I think there's a real opportunity. Again, I think that AID is really good at this, and I would double down on these programs because it's the governance side, not the model hasn't suddenly changed. People aren't suddenly saying, you're right, I give up, no more democracy.
Gayle?
So I'd say a couple things, and we certainly have an administrator now who has made, I think, democracy and human rights sort of hallmark of her
Exactly.
tenure. I think there are a couple things we need to think about. Some recent polling, global polling, found that in low and low middle income countries, close to 50% of people said they would give up some of their freedom and democracy to have greater economic benefits or standing. Like, democracy is great, but if I could have a job, that would probably
I'll go with that.
help as well.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things we need to think about, and I say think about because I'm not sure what the answer is we need democracies that deliver. It's great to be advocating for democracy, but if a democracy can't deliver to the majority of its producers who may be in the ag sector, to kids who want to get to school, to the huge wave of young people we're seeing in Africa where the demand for jobs far outstrips the actual creation of jobs. So I think one of the things we need to think about is, do we need to have some space between democracy and development, but also think about them together? Because you've got to have the capacity to govern, but the capacity to govern to deliver. I think that's one. I think there's a looming danger that we face, though, a looming danger, which is, Raj used the phrase, Henrietta echoed it, I think we all have, that we're kind of losing. I think one of the absolutely unintended consequences of the stance of the West on Ukraine has been a perception that democracy matters more in some places than in others. And a friend of mine who is Tigrayan, in the wake of the horrible fighting that's gone on in Ethiopia, said nobody's ever heard of Tigray. I should have told them it was in Europe. Probably should have. And none of that suggests that we shouldn't have the stance or be doing what we're doing in Ukraine. That's not the issue. The issue is, if we are going to blow through every budget and do everything that we are doing in Ukraine because a big country invaded a small country, or because of the egregious violations of human rights that we rightly talk about all the time, are we also focusing on those in other parts of the world? And the perception is that we're not. And I think the votes, I just add one other thing on this. I don't think the votes in the UN Security Council were about whether countries were for democracy or for invasion. I think what some of those countries said to me, and there's an exception, I think Eritrea absolutely voted with Russia with great enthusiasm, is that we're too poor to pick sides. And that if you are a low-income country and there's going to be great power contestation, you actually might need some commodities from Russia. Doesn't export much, but it exports a lot of commodities.
And weapons.
And weapons. Well, we sell weapons too. And people want to stay on our good side to buy weapons. And China finances pretty much everything. So I think there's a widening perhaps of the aperture that we need to do to think about what does democracy look like from our point of view if you are sitting in Sudan right now. What are you thinking about the world, what the world thinks about democracy? Now, last thing I'll say, we can't do everything everywhere. I get that. But there is I think the world is perceiving a really significant gap. And I think we just got to think about that. I think there's much more we could do to balance that.
Henrietta, let me turn to you.
So let me pick up on Gayle's democracy has to deliver. And this is something that we really talked about with Latin America, that it was essential. And I think it's the key. I think if democracies don't deliver for their people, then people become unhappy, they become disappointed, they won't re-vote for that person again. So the deliverance is very important. So to Mark's point, can you teach governments to deliver? And that's part of the issue. The other part is the youth. They are so excited about running our world. And as Bill and many others know who've worked with youth, if you can give them a little bit of training, and maybe it's on a cell phone, they can take it and run with it. So democracy is very messy, and you have to teach a lot of things with it, but the delivery of what it gives, the benefits that are broad-based to a society, is what you have to focus on. And then to your point on corruption, as I look over the decades of the world, I think who the leader is matters. Yeah. If the leader is clean, cares about no corruption, I mean, take Singapore or another place, it will be clean. If you don't have a leader like that, there's no chance. People take a role model from above. And it's one reason why USAID and our enormous legacy over the decades has to be sustained. There have to be a way that our programs can continue, even if the funding, public funding ends in 3 years, there has to be a way that there's a 10, 20-year life to the programs. The ideas and ideals of America are embedded in those programs, and that's what you need to carry on.
So Henry, can I just thank you for your leadership at UNICEF and broadening the definition of children to include youth? I think that was very important, and so I think of UNICEF not just as a children's agency, but as a youth agency. So thank you for doing that in your time at UNICEF. So, Raj.
Well, I think I agree wholeheartedly with all the comments here. I would just add, because it hasn't been said, that the American domestic example matters a great deal, and I think all of us heard quite a bit from our friends, colleagues, and partners around the world that when America's leaders are perceived as not respecting democratic processes and values, it opens up a lot of space around the world for authoritarian leaders to behave quite egregiously and to do so in a much more brazen fashion that probably overpowers the ability of very good USAID programs to move in the other directions.
You're right. So, Raj, you've made technology a hallmark of much of your career, and thanks for all you've done on that. I think about COVID in terms of accelerating the digital transition. And I think that the digital divide is going to get closed in rural Maryland. It's going to get closed in Moldova. It's going to get closed in Malaysia. It's going to get closed in Mali. And so USAID played a big role through things like the Leland Initiative and bringing technology and the internet to places like Africa. It also played a role in kind of teeing up and setting the table for the first cell phone revolution. We now have this new digital revolution, and it's kind of open for what that's going to look like. So could you talk a little bit about what role AID and maybe perhaps the United States ought to be playing in terms of accelerating and bringing this digital transformation to the rest of the world?
Sure. Maybe I'll make two comments. The first is, I think we have to really step back and say, if you're dispassionately evaluating digital infrastructure and innovations that enable public service delivery, personal identification, anti-corruption in the delivery of subsidies and cash transfers, and the ability to conduct financial transactions and other types of transactions in a modern economy, you probably would look outside of the United States and the Western world for those cutting-edge breakthroughs.
Like Ukraine, for example.
Well, Africa is well ahead of America in terms of digital payments, as we all know. India has a health and financial transaction system that's well ahead of our use of credit cards here in the United States, with a cost per transaction that's 1/100th of what it is here. Just because we don't see it doesn't mean it's not inefficient and expensive. And so I would caution us to be of the mindset that somehow exporting American digital infrastructure regulations, models, and transactions approaches to the rest of the world is a smart or wise idea. In fact, we'd probably benefit greatly by understanding and studying how Estonia protects private information, how India built a infrastructure for a personal data stack that allows for all kinds of different sectors to exploit low transactions costs and move leap functions ahead on a population of 1.4 billion, or how in Africa you can make mobile payments to a mini grid provider for just the amount of electricity you consume that day in a system that's not otherwise financially viable. None of that really exists here. So we should be investing heavily in learning and spreading these best practices, but we should be doing it in a way that is understanding where the real innovation is. I'd say the second point I'd make is really about USAID. And Peter represents to me the basic idea that American development investment is at its best when we find those areas of American innovation and bring them to places where they will lift humanity most profoundly. And of course, agricultural technology is the one I'm referring to in the context of the land-grant university system and our history around the Green Revolution. And food systems need further transformation, and American science and technology is at the cutting edge of that potential transition. The other big area that I think is hugely underexploited by US foreign policy is the green energy revolution. There's this mindset that the green energy revolution is all about private investment to build solar parks to sell onto the grid. And that is a really, really narrow view of the world. The truth is, 20, 25 years from now, Indian buses are going to have batteries that are going to represent at night a plug-in source of power that they're able to serve as grid backup. Malawi is going to have a greater share of lithium-ion battery storage on its grid than many states in the United States. And I just think we have to think about access to battery storage, innovations around different types of micro energy production, what kinds of new jobs are created in the transition from coal-based and fossil fuel-based to renewables, including distributed renewables, and the types of business models that become available when a big chunk of your population is in the business of installing, servicing, doing financial transactions on, and building out further opportunity using green energy. And that, if one were defining a new green revolution today, as our predecessors did in the mid-60s and early 70s, it would be around the energy technology revolution and what that could mean for the world.
So Henrietta, if we think about kind of this accelerating digital revolution that's happening, I'd welcome your thoughts about how you see it and what role AID could play in that.
So can I pick up
Yes,
on
of
what Raj
course.
said? Because of course I'm in total agreement. And I think one of the things that we now have in the world is there are a number of technology radars that have started. So there's one in Geneva, JESDA has, where they're looking at all of the technologies that are being developed around the world and what's going to be important in the next 10 to 20 years. That's a sort of a radar that you realize you can do different things with. And to Raj's list of opportunities, I think energy is very important, but I think water is another one that the United States really could be strong on, because it hits the climate, it hits health, it's a technology. So I dream that we could connect every school in the world to the internet. I think it would be an enormous gift to this generation. If we don't, the half of the world that's not connected is going to be simply left so far behind that this generation won't be able to talk to each other in the same way that our generations have been. So if we could connect every school in the world to the internet, it could be with lower satellites, it could be little Wi-Fi on top of the schoolhouses, it could mean that in a village, your parents as well as you could go to the schoolhouse, and then there would be a value to learning and to going to school, and then maybe more girls could be going to school. Maybe that can even happen in some of the countries that are not letting the girls go to school.
Yeah.
I think it would change how our world operates, but we need to get connectivity out there. It's a technology play. And then, Dan, the other thing that's still, that we haven't wrestled with is the privacy issue. So for Ebola, we were able to track in, let's say, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where people would go if they got sick, where were their home bases, because we knew where they would go to. It meant that we could have supplies there in those towns waiting for people. It was a health benefit, but is an invasion of privacy. So I think we just have to, in the digital world, we have to overcome that and say that for these reasons, we would like to have transparency, and for these reasons, we do not want to have transparency, and know when we do both.
So either of you want to take on tech, because I want to pivot to climate. Yeah.
One quick thing. So I think one of the things that Raj is pointing to, we're pretty clumsy in how we're doing our messaging right now on energy overseas. And we're pushing things, and we're talking in terms of the debates that take place inside the Beltway. And out in the field in Africa, people are scratching their heads. They don't understand what we're talking about. One of the things that I think we should do more of, incentivizing in contests, right? Open app design contests. There is, particularly in Africa, they are so far ahead of us. We're not going to catch up, nor should we try. It's different technologies. We do a lousy job of talking about how we partner with youth around the world and empower them. It's not that we should be pushing, it's that they should be pulling. And so we're just not very good right now in the way that we're messaging on this. And I think we're talking past a lot of young people around the world.
Yeah, I would just say briefly, one of the challenges any administrator of USAID faces is that you're earmarked from two sides. Everybody wants to do everything, right? Outside the agency, inside the agency. And there are 99 things we should all be doing if your goal and agenda is global development. I would say I would not recommend that USAID get into digitization as a big thing, to be frank. For one of the reasons that Raj says, in low-income countries where you don't have half of what we've got in terms of banking systems, it's the greatest innovation you've ever seen. So people were making mobile payments in Kenya years before people in Washington, D.C. were. Years before. And the innovation in digital expansion is coming from places where people are leapfrogging, and they've got necessity and opportunity to do it. And they're not burdened by the way we think, because we build on this past.
Legacy
They're
stuff.
looking out and saying, what do we need to do? So if there's any role for USAID in that, whether it's Henrietta's connecting schools or it is helping those young innovators get to scale and replicate. One of the things Raj and I worked on together, Power Africa, which USAID led, the foreign assistance component of that was not huge. It was grease the wheel money, right? And it's so using those kinds of funds to help get scale. And the last thing is also take a look at the African private sector on this. There's some extraordinary things being done by the African private sector, and I think I'd look there. I think sometimes there's a perception that Africa's really poor and it just doesn't have digital coverage, and it doesn't have, we got parts of the United States that don't have digital coverage. It's got more digital innovation and speed of expansion than anywhere I've seen. So on the tech side, I would go with, I think what's been said, look at education, look at ag, look at energy.
Okay.
Digital, I don't think is our strong suit.
Okay.
It's important.
So climate has been the central, sort of a central organizing principle for the Biden administration. And if we think about decarbonization, it doesn't mean dematerialization. And we're going to have to do a lot more mining to have all of the electric batteries that we're going to have, whether it's copper, whether it's lithium, whether it's cobalt. There's a whole series of ethical challenges and human rights challenges, and we're going to have to increase the amount of mineral mining and metals processing by orders of magnitude. But when I talk to folks at AID or I talk to folks in the MDBs or the DFIs about how much do you love mining and minerals and metals processing, they'd rather get a root canal than to talk about this. So I'd be curious about what role, it strikes me that we're going to have to spend a lot more money, either as catalytic money or dealing with human rights and managing resources, but we're going to have to see a lot more mining to achieve the carbon transition that we want to see happen. So I'd be curious what each of you has to say about specifically what's the role of AID and development in terms of managing these really thorny and difficult issues around mining, minerals, and metals processing. Gayle, why don't we start with you?
Is there a mining department?
No, I think we should create one. I actually would argue we need to create one, and I would argue we ought to spend as much on food security, which is about $1 billion a year, as we're going to have to spend on mining, minerals, and metals processing if we want to achieve the carbon transition in a just way.
Well, okay. I'd say a couple things. I think we need a fundamentally different framework for these energy required and rare earth minerals.
Yeah.
There's this thing called oil
Yeah.
that a lot of poor countries had a lot of. And what happened with that was that countries that didn't have enough oil but had a lot of money basically imported the oil. And go to Nigeria and the Delta today and see how well that worked out. I think there's an opportunity, given the demand on the battery and other sides, to rethink the model a bit. So, and this is a live discussion, the conference I was just at in Nairobi, very live discussion, because there is an active presence of everybody in the world saying, I'd really like to do a mining venture with you, right? Or I'd really like to buy that mine. And the conversation that's coming out is one that says, what about value addition in these countries? So what about 50-50 ownership of a battery plant in the country that's got the minerals that we want, as opposed to doing all the mining and just the extraction in the way that oil was done? So I think before you think about what's USAID's role, is what's the vision for how the world is going to deal with these assets? And given that a lot of low and middle income countries have a lot of the assets, they've got a different view of how it's going to work this time around. And I think it's a view that welcomes investment from the United States and partnership with the United States. I think it's a model that is going to demand value addition and some local role. So that's, I think, layer one. I think, I'm not sure USAID's got much expertise in either mining or mining investment. I think it gets to some of the governance issues where USAID comes in, is in something like mining. Extractive industries, you've got to have some agreement, same with dams and other big infrastructure, between governments, the private entities, and citizens. And you've got to have some arrangement there that allows for the three things to work in concert. USAID may have a role there, but I think even before you get to that, how do we think this is going to work in a world that we hopefully want to see as more fair and more prosperous for everybody?
I think we're going to have to develop a lot of expertise, just as we did when we started working on democracy and human rights issues in the 80s. We're going to have to develop a deep expertise in mining minerals and metals, because I think if we're going to achieve this, there's going to have to be a lot of all the things you've talked about, whether it's kind of the rules of the game, how do we deal with human rights issues around cobalt mining, how do we deal with equitably managing the resources that come from these mining, how do we establish metals processing in parts of the world, other than places that may not be friendly to us. Something like 40% of the metals processing is in China. And so we're going to have a major challenge to deal with on this. And so I think the aid. Is
your question about
I think the aid
minerals
community
that we
hasn't.
need, or is this about from a development
So
perspective?
I think it's both. I think that I don't think this conversation. I think the climate conversation is not priced in the issue of the fact that we are going to have to. Decarbonization doesn't mean dematerialization, and so we're going to have to, as a world and as a West, decide, okay, we're going to have to make some difficult trade-offs, and we're going to have to support, through the MDBs, through AID, a number of things to make mining and minerals more just, more clean, human rights, how it's done, some of the things that you're talking about.
I think all I would say is,
Yeah.
I don't think it's just up to the West. I think there are a lot of citizens in a lot of countries that have these resources
Yeah.
that care deeply about how it's done. So
Yep.
I think the place to start is there, rather than our figuring out how it should be done by us or others.
Okay.
I think engage with those countries that have the resources. Because I will say, I've started traveling again like many of us, realized I forgot how to pack, but other than that, this is an issue that comes up again and again and again, is what is the demand going to be in the energy sector? And we would be very, very wise to be engaging with particularly
Right.
poor countries that have these assets. About
I 100%
how
agree
it's
with
gonna
that.
work.
I 100% agree with that. My point is that one of the vectors by which we're going to need to do that is through institutions like AID.
Sure.
Mark?
So a few things. Let's remember that with respect to many of the critical mineral assets, deposits, however you want to refer to them, the question isn't capital. So as we start to look at what the U.S., first of the USAID role is, it's more around things like de-risking, right? There are private capital flows. USAID isn't going to be mining or buying mines, nor should it. It's looking for a way to de-risk. It's looking for a way to provide some predictability. It's looking for a way, oftentimes what stops U.S. capital from flowing into a country and into an investment, again, are things like the liability that's out there, but it's also regulatory capacity. So, so every business in the U.S. can look on the front page of any financial publication, and it will talk about the investment opportunities in Africa. So why don't they? Well, they're not stupid. They'd like to do it, but sometimes what happens is the regulatory process is so slow that they lose the value of the investment along the way. So it's looking for ways to help countries build their regulatory capacity so they can respond in a timely fashion to opportunities. It's not to say whether or not they should do it, that's their call, but oftentimes they simply don't have the capacity to process a potential opportunity. And you've heard me say that I don't believe everything is in terms of great power competition in China, but this is one of the areas where it is, because authoritarians don't actually require the same things that we require in terms of investments. They can move much more quickly. We need to enhance our own capacities, our own investment tools. This is an area where I think the DFC is terrifically important, and we should be, quite frankly, enhancing its capacity. It doesn't have nearly the capacity that I think it should have in this area, but it's also understanding what private businesses are looking for as they go to invest. And it's not that USAID needs to buy things or invest in things. It's instead recognizing what our role can be in that de-risking and regulatory capacity opportunity. You know, one of the things that we've done at various times over the years is we've provided funding to countries to help them analyze in an objective fashion some of the opportunities that come their way, including opportunities from other types of economies and governments, because they don't have that ability. And when they're able to get an objective analysis, we don't tell them up or down on a U.S. investment. We're pretty good. We're pretty competitive where that's done. So look for ways to build that capacity. And quite frankly, my money's on U.S. private enterprise and private investment, but they do need that help sometimes in building that capacity.
That's my point is, if you think about the telecoms revolution in the 90s or Power Africa, the ways in which AID played a role in terms of the rules of the game, capacity building, sort of these sorts of issues, I think we're going to have to sort through.
I'm not sure we're going to have the ability to define the rules of the game, but I do think we can help countries as they design their rules.
Yes,
we can enhance their
correct.
capacity.
That's the point I'm making. Thank you. Henrietta.
So I'm in the group that says that this is a public-private issue, and it's ideal for public-private partnerships. I think USAID is not going to be the lead in this, to Gayle's point. It's just, it cannot be. But can it help? Yes, but I would send this to like the IFC or some other entities that could help worldwide in what does an agreement look like that's fair to the country as well as it's fair to the corporations that are doing the work. It's going to be an area where electrons and molecules are going to connect with each other, so there's going to be artificial creations of one thing or another. We can help on the human rights.
Think about cobalt and mining.
Yeah, the cobalt and mining and for children is clearly an issue, and you don't want that.
No.
And you don't want, in the recycling world, I mean, there are a lot of batteries out there in the world that need to be recycled. So there's a whole knock-on of activities that we in USAID could be helping with, but they have to be public-private. The companies will have far more capacity than any local government or community. So build out that public-private thinking, and we can attack mining.
Okay. Raj?
Nothing to add.
Good.
Beyond,
Okay.
Beyond those great comments.
All right, I want to hear from a couple of thoughtful people in the audience. I know we've got a couple of microphones. I didn't tell my colleagues, but I just think this is a friendly group. I would be remiss if I didn't hear from my friend Peter McPherson. So Peter, thanks for being here. We sit over on the IFAS board together, your former aid administrator. I explained to you that I had 4 slots, and so I promised I'm inviting you and some of the other folks I didn't include next year, so thanks for being here. But I wanted to give you a chance to make a comment, if you would, and I'm thrilled to see you.
I'm happy to be here.
Here's a microphone.
Happy to be here because I respect and frankly, I'm very interested in what your 4 former administrators have to say. I think a lot of very perceptive things have been said here. I love Gayle's, as an academic administrator, I love the comment that soft power needs to be a required course, not an elective. Thought that pulled it right together. I've got a lot of thoughts, of course, but I think that the reality is that we have a world that's being changed so rapidly and will continue to be by technology and communication. And to no surprise, what AID is doing, done in the past, no doubt can greatly benefit, and we have to structure what we're doing on that basis. It's almost a central theme today, as much or really more than financing. It's technology and the related communication. I think, and those tie into institutional building. Several of you mentioned this. You got to have institutions, and institutions are fundamentally made up of people. So people have to be trained, be educated. So those are my quick thoughts. So I would say a couple other things, is that the return to the localization concept, which I think is productive. Localization is what the World Bank has tried to do for years, and there have been problems. There's some lessons there. I do think that we need more regional money as we look at these technology communication issues. They're really not country specific. They're regional questions. I do think that that the global goods are an important part of things. Anyway, I've got lots of thoughts, but it's good to, I will go on. I will sit down and so many,
Thanks,
I see all
Peter.
my old colleagues here.
I know. So what I'm going to do is I'll bunch a couple of comments and let folks reflect. I know my friend Paul Foldy is here. I'd love to hear from him. Paul?
Dan, thanks so very much. Paul Foldy with the Professional Services Council. We represent the contractors who do the implementation of all the good work that's up there on the stage. And I wanted to reflect on a comment that Mark Green said, that the story that doesn't get told enough, of course, is the work that all of your NGOs and your contracting partners do to implement the great work that you all give them. And so I wanted to give a quick shout out to the current administrator of Respect the Power. We just had a great event, both the contractors and the NGOs meeting with your contractors and your agreements officers, talking to them about how we try to implement your policies and what's good and what's bad. And now there's this great phrase, the bureaucratic burden busting, and I know you all tried that as well, and it was a great event.
It's a great
very
alliteration.
harmonious. And then I get back to my office and there's a message on my answering machine alerting me to an article that says, we're really sorry, we just want to make sure you see it, we feel terrible. But I get this article and there I'm reading about the Beltway bandits yet again. So I was just wondering, could we please all agree to just take that phrase and throw it on the ash heap of history and acknowledge that we're all working to help you do your job, and at the same time, any thoughts that you have on how we can reduce that bureaucratic burden for all the folks who are doing this, the contracting officers at USAID who are doing at least 3 to 5 times the work of their DoD counterparts as well, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay,
So thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul. You're welcome. Thank you. All right, let me just suggest the following. We're coming to the end of our time. I think what I would say is I'd ask each of you to just either reflect on anything that Peter or Paul have said here, or any kind of final closing thoughts. You can either kind of respond to anything that's been put here in the audience, or just any kind of parting thoughts you want to leave. So let me start with you, Mark.
Well, one thing that Peter touched upon a few times, and it may not grab the headlines of digitization or critical minerals, is capacity building, right? And it's the bread and butter of USAID, and we don't talk about it enough. If we're going to truly be good partners around the world, it is providing the technical expertise and the training and the linkages and opportunities to help countries lead themselves. At the end of the day, that's what countries want. And so, we can help to steer a little bit, but it really is helping countries to steer and row that I think is the hallmark of success. And that's how you build good alliances and partnerships, and that's how we expand our reach as a country.
We're a supporting actor in somebody else's movie, right? We're ultimately, it's someone else's film. We're supporting.
Let's put it this way. The first thing that we should do when we go overseas is stop and listen. And we're really good at going in with our talking points. And again, this goes back many, many years, but we go in and we say, okay, these are the things we want you to do. We don't begin by saying, how are things going? What can we do to help? To me, that's the hallmark of all of this, and it's something that USAID is good at, and we need to keep pushing out.
Good. Gayle?
That USAID is vital is without question. I think, unfortunately, that needs to be said again and again and again. People need to be reminded of it. I thank you for the nice words, Raj. We worked very hard in the Obama administration to elevate USAID and the whole notion of development. We've got to keep doing that because it kind of falls off the margins a bit. And this is not a reflection on the US per se, but globally, there's a lot less discussion of these kinds of issues than I've seen in my entire career right now. It's just not on the radar, on the menu, on the table. It's not anywhere. So I think there's a really important and urgent need to talk about what development is. That word development doesn't mean anything to most people. They think it's the fundraising part of your organization or something. So we've got to capture what it is. It's this building capacity. It is ensuring, based on our values, that people everywhere can live in dignity. It's investing in the future we want to live in. We've got to find ways to talk about this that capture the imagination, I think, of the public and of decision makers. We've also got to do it very, very quickly. I've been in DC for a long time, a lot of events at think tanks. I don't know that I've been at an event in a long time where "we are losing" was said on a panel the way it's been said on this one. And I think it's not a criticism, it's an observation. We were talking earlier, 24 countries have requested to join the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
The BRICS Bank.
No, the BRICS.
Just the BRICS, the club.
Yes.
Wow.
And I think we're going to see the emergence of a new non-aligned movement. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but this is a non-aligned movement that includes Russia and China.
A non-aligned, aligned movement.
Exactly. So they're only non-aligned to the West.
Right.
And some of that is ideology and politics and all of that. But there's also some reasons that this is happening. So I think as we make the case for development and soft power called something else, we've also got to keep our eyes wide open at some trends that are unfolding in the world where I think our influence, our relevance, our ability to shape the world is going to be defined in the next few years.
Henrietta?
So I think part of why we don't capture the imagination is that development is a long-term activity. But we sometimes don't deal with it that way. So we have to rethink how to be really long-term in terms of our impact. And it's to Mark's point about how you listen locally. It's to Gayle's point about are we winning or losing. It's to Raj's point about technologies. We have to find a way that that staying power accumulates into something important. I think that the fastest way to get there is to choose something that we believe in, like connect every school in the world to the internet. If you do that as the United States, you could do it in the next 3 years, you know, it would capture people's imagination. They would say, every one of my schools is connected to the internet. People would feel, they would own it. And I think the United States needs to have something exciting, driving, and something that's of benefit locally that would make a big difference.
And refugee camps and displaced camps, as you and I have been talking about.
Yes, exactly, because all of those young people have a huge desire to join the world. And so let's meet it. Let's go where they are. The second thing is, I think sometimes to your Beltway Bandits point, is that we don't talk as much about everybody who's part of AID. It isn't just the employees who are Foreign Service or General Service. But the funding, the operational funds are really important, or we don't have good people in the field. And the best item we have are Americans who are actually working in the field. So I know that polio would never have been addressed without the Rotary International, without Gates being there. They're partners out there that we have relied on for decades. And without them, USAID is smaller. But we administrators all know that, and we really were speaking for everyone. It wasn't just our government agency.
I'm going to ask everyone, Raj, I'll give you a chance to come, but I want to come back and ask you each to say, okay, what's the big compelling initiative we could do as a country? I think Henrietta put her finger on something. I think, so I'd ask you, Mark and Gayle, to think about that, but I'll give you a chance, Raj, just to give some parting thoughts, but also, you know, I'm sure you'll have a thought about what's a big moonshot project we ought to get behind.
Well, the moonshot projects we ought to get behind, I think, map to things you've heard on this panel that where we have unrivaled excellence. There's no reason why we couldn't extend the work Gayle started and think of our global health footprint as a more integrated global platform and point it towards building the capability to prevent the next pandemic. We actually have the money and the partners and the technical capacity to do that without a lot of deep political work, I think. That's one. Another is the one I mentioned around renewable energy technology. I mean, America is about to make the largest investment since the post-World War II era in our domestic economy and reshaping the structure of that economy. That is a source of vibrancy and partnership and collaboration that if it could also be harnessed and transferred in some appropriate way to our development mission abroad, you could imagine future USAID colleagues sitting with heads of state and planning ministers and saying, okay, how does the climate transition create developmental opportunity for Nigeria, for Chad, for Bangladesh, and building the connectivity now that we have DFC and other instruments to really make that possible. That's what animated the several decades long movement that became the Green Revolution in agriculture. But you got to stick with it for decades, you know, to make it happen. To Henrietta's point about long-term and discipline around measuring results. I guess I'd go back to the basic observation that I think I think the reason Gayle says that compared to, you know, a lot of the work you've done, Gayle, that this window of time, you're seeing less kind of global attention from everybody on the challenge of shared prosperity is that we live in a world that's teetering on the edge of, some nasty populist politics pretty much everywhere. And so it seems to me there needs to be a new political framing for a very post-World War II concept of development. And I don't know what that framing is, but it would have, the elements of it would be seizing the opportunity of the climate transition in a way that's honest and creating opportunity and lifting up the peoples of different places. It would be embracing the ability of people to be non-aligned, but not allowing for countries and peoples to fall under the narrative that Russia and China somehow represent a non-aligned space that's all about heavy public sector role in building and driving and managing an economy, and the detraction of democratic process in the process. And ultimately, it's about what Henrietta said. It's somehow getting American political leaders and American people and people around the world to see that people living with dignity very, very, very far away from you makes you better. It makes you safer, it makes you more prosperous, and even though we don't use the language day to day, it has a underlying moral purpose that's more connected to who we are as a country than it is connected to who our opponents are as countries. And that somehow has to be said in a way that can be heard effectively by lots of different age groups and populations and sectors of our own society.
Good. So, Mark and Gayle, I want to give you a chance to double dip and just what's the big moonshot thing we ought to get behind? Mark, let me start with you.
So I'm going to offer two thoughts here. First off, and we've had discussion on messaging and how difficult that can be. One of the things that I tried to do when I was at AID is to be open and honest about mistakes. And then follow that up by saying, yeah, this is hard. This is really hard. We work in really hard, difficult places. We don't always get it right, but we're trying every single day. And I think we need to foster the risk-taking that has always been behind some of the best innovations that we have fostered. So that's an important message. We shouldn't be shy about saying, yeah, this is hard, we don't always get it perfect. Secondly, and I didn't conspire with Peter McPherson, but I would say that we have done a lousy job at building on one of the greatest strengths that we have, and that is higher education exchanges. We're really good at this. Our higher education system is the envy of the world, and there was a time when everyone came to American universities, and we've all had the experience of meeting with government leaders who said, yeah, I went to school here, or Michigan State, or if they were really good, University of Wisconsin, they really got to aspire. But we've got to get back to that. Maybe it's a symptom of other trends, and I'm the son of immigrants. We look at immigrants askance these days in our populist politics. We should foster those exchanges, right? That's one of the greatest advantages that we have, and I think that aid can play an important role in helping to resurrect that and utilize it more, as we once did.
Look, I think all of these are good ideas, and I don't know what the what is, but I would also look at the ag sector, because I think that's somewhere where we've got expertise, we've got our land-grant universities, we've got all sorts of companies and others, and the technology potential is huge. But I think what I would say about any moonshot is, for it to be a moonshot, it's got to get to something that I think was said earlier in the panel. It's got to be bipartisan. And in doing so, it's got to answer the mail on, Raj, the point you made about what's going on with our democracy impacts how people hear us when we talk about democracy. And, projecting our values feels squishy like soft power, right? It's like, you say that and people say, oh, you're part of the do-gooder community. And it's anyway, it's not necessary.
That's a bad thing.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I am not evil. Thank you. But I think what propels any big moonshot, USAID can propel it, money can propel it. When it is bipartisan in the message that this is what America does, it's incredibly powerful because it sends multiple messages. It yields impact at scale. It sends the message that this is what we are about. And it sends the message that our politics are such that there's some things that are bigger than all of us. That even if we disagree on many things, we can agree on one thing. And that is an unbelievably powerful message. And it's a message that people aren't hearing enough. And it's a message that I think all of us as citizens have an obligation to double down on and get out there with. Because right now the message we're sending is we're divided.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. This was great. Please join me in thanking our panelists.